Hello and welcome. You are listening to a podcast by the Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath. I'm Professor Terry King, your host, and today I'm talking to Chris Packham, famous naturalist, nature photographer, television presenter, and author. He's known for presenting Spring Watch, Autumn Watch, Winter Watch, shows about nature, about neurodiversity, dinosaurs, cats, dogs, and honeybees, among others. Chris, you've had such a varied career. Is there any one of those that really means more to you than the others?
I don't think so. I'm a forward-looking person, so the things that I'm always most excited about is what's coming next. I'm not a nostalgic in any way, shape or form. I'm not a guy that gets old photographs out, and I certainly don't sort of pore over old programs either. So I'm always excited by learning new things. And, you know, part of the process that I'm lucky to enjoy when it comes to making these programs is that I get to learn on the job. I'm firmly involved in the University of Life, and it's centred around natural sciences, which interests me, of course. But that's the greatest joy. So at the moment, we're just wrapping up a couple of series. And then I had a conversation this week with the people who commission new programs at the BBC, and we've been talking about what we're doing next. And I have to say that's currently more exciting.
Because I've been hearing rumours about this. You're doing a television series about evolution, aren't you? Which, of course, we at the Milner Centre are very excited about. Tell me about it.
So we made a series a couple of years ago about the history of Earth, which is, of course, a very large topic that stretches back a very long time. So from that point of view, it's quite incomprehensible, quite intangible for many people to get to grips with. When you talk about tens of years, we can just about cope with it. Hundreds, we struggle. Thousands, let alone millions and billions, is quite beyond us. But we wanted to tell this story in a different way. We wanted to obviously implement as much of the new science as possible. So that's another reason why we make these docs is, you know, we're firmly trying to get our finger on the pulse of the latest published research so that we can integrate that into the story, which is sometimes a revision of a story that people think they know, but in fact, subsequently it's been found out to be slightly different. Our mission, therefore, was to make that, you know, comprehensible. But also, one of the reasons why we made the programme is that many of the events that have happened to our planet, certainly the living part of our planet, are pertinent to this point in the planet's history. And it was a pretty thinly veiled look, certainly the last couple of programmes, about the impact of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. We've had catastrophic biodiversity loss in the past. We've had what would be, from our perspective, changes in the climate, but they've had a profound impact on the history of the planet, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, of course. So as a series idea, it worked. So we were thinking, what are the other big topics that sometimes people, you know, grapple to understand? And evolution was a case in point. And I think simply because the way that we're classically taught or we perceive evolution is something that started a very long time ago, and it's happened very slowly over, again, millions of years. And to some extent, you know, we are the be-all and end-all of it, you know, because this is the point where we understand it. Therefore, it seems to have miraculously stopped. And of course, none of those things are true. So we wanted to take a fresh look at evolution, integrating that new science. So what we did was, rather than, you know, start at the origin of life and bring it chronologically forward to this point, we chose topics which we felt would be accessible to people. So we've got a programme about the evolution of feeding, and we've got a programme about the evolution of locomotion and the evolution of thinking. And of course, they do stretch back through time, when we look at the origins and how these capacities have increased over time and how they've changed over time, and also some of the dead ends, the things that didn't work that we found out about. So we've got one more day to shoot, actually, with myself and my poodles, Sid and Nancy. Don't ask how we're integrating two black miniature poodles into a series about evolution. It's actually to do with locomotion. So we're looking at the fact that dogs are standing on their toes and their gait, as it were. And then we'll go through the computer-generated phase of integrating all of that material. The narrative's all there, so we know what we need, but that's quite slow to produce. So it won't be finished until the latter part of this year, 2025, and it will go out next year at some point.
And I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the things I find out when I'm talking to people about evolution, they very much think dinosaurs, millions of years, not realizing it's happening right under our very noses right now.
It's happening in their back gardens.
Exactly.
You know, since 1970, the great tits which are a common garden bird on people's feeders if they feed them, their beaks have grown longer than they have in the Netherlands, where this study was conducted. And that's because they're on our feeders. And they've grown their beaks a fraction of a millimetre longer because they spend more time, stretching inside those feeders to remove food. Our blackcaps, which are now a species which are overwintering in people's gardens. When I was a kid, when I first got into birds, they were migrants. They went to Iberia, Northern Africa. Now they're not migrating. Our birds invariably are leaving, but we get birds from Germany that come here because our climate is now sufficiently warm. And as a consequence of that, they're not flying as far. Their wings have got shorter. And this is actually happening very quickly because those German birds that come here for the winter obviously get back to Germany in the spring more quickly than they would if they were travelling from Africa or Iberia. Therefore, they get the best territories. So again, those genes are prospering, and we're seeing a change not just in the physiology of the animal, shortening of the wings, but its behaviour. It's coming to the UK rather than heading to Spain for its winter holiday.
And again, I think stuff that we try to talk about at the Milner Centre is that our understanding of evolution allows us to, understand what's kind of happening, but how can we use that in terms of conservation? So, for example, if we know about biodiversity amongst elephants, for example, in different groups, are there bottlenecks happening where the genetic diversity is not as big as it could be? Can we create corridors? So it's that understanding of evolutionary processes that allow us to sort of answer some of the global questions that there are.
Yeah, I think that's implicitly important. I mean, I'm a sucker for what we used to call blue sky science. I like knowing things because I like to know things. And therefore, I would always excuse scientists who devote their lives to understanding something which you might at that point argue doesn't have a practical aspect in contemporary society. But at the same time, we are in a crisis and we are losing many species and we're endangered ourselves. So I think that applying natural sciences and what we understand from them to help us at this critical point is something which we need to advocate for. And we do, and certainly understanding, as you say, understanding evolution, bottlenecks, genetics, how species originate, which species are more robust or more resilient, and where does that resilience come from? Is it simply at the behavioural level, or is it at the genetic level? And we know that some species are more resistant to diseases. That could quite clearly be a genetic reason for that. So we live in that humanscape where we need to manage that environment, and fully understanding the needs or the fragility of species is something which we have to have at our disposal to be able to do that properly.
It so comes across talking to you about how passionate you are about this. And I was lucky enough to read one of your books about your childhood and how you came to be interested in nature. So you talk about this really beautiful moment, actually, where you are looking at fox cubs and a fox family. And it was a really magical thing to read, actually. But is there a particular moment in your childhood that you go, that's where my love of nature started?
Well, my parents say I was fascinated before I could speak. And my memory stretched back to about 4.5. I mean, obviously, I've got quite a good memory from starting school, which at that point was 5 years old in the UK. By then, I was already hooked. It was dinosaurs and bats at that point. The first thing I did on my first day at school was make a modelling clay T-Rex, So we had a very small garden in suburban Southampton. I would crawl around picking up everyday creatures, slugs and snails and ladybirds. And I remember standing by the gate. Our neighbour had a particular type of bush. I don't know which plant species it was, but it was always festooned with ladybirds. And I would catch them and put them into a matchbox that my parents would give me. And I remember them climbing on my hands, and I remember them taking off and me being astonished by their little red elytra cracking open and their orange wings unfolding, and then they'd sort of drift or waft up into the sky. There was a magic about nature. And I think that what attracted me to it in the first place was its just simple beauty. Everything I found, it didn't matter whether it was a worm or a ladybird or a tadpole or a newt, was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. From a child's point of view, we can forgive that superficiality. Soon, it got to the point where I wanted to understand them. And what that meant was, unfortunately, for me, it became about capturing them and enclosing them. So it was tadpoles in jam jars, and it was lizards in tanks and all of those sorts of things. And I would put them in whatever receptacle I deemed appropriate, and I'd sit there and stare at them and study them. I'd try to learn as much about them, and I'd read all about them, obviously. But it wasn't until I got to my early teens, my father bought me a pair of binoculars, that I almost instantaneously learned that I could, figure out a lot more about behaviour and ecology and everything else by watching the animals in their environment, not incarcerating them in mine. And so from that point onwards, getting close to them in the wild, being able to witness, behaviours that I don't understand, that I can ask questions about, is still the thing that brings me enormous joy.
And you've had decades of being a wildlife presenter. So have you got a kind of most awe-inspiring kind of wildlife moment when you've been doing these television programs?
Well, there have been so many. I grew up in a 3 up, 3 down. I used to get hand-me-down National Geographic, so I never dared dream that I would travel to those parts of the world and see those species. I'm 64 years old, and I still take the trouble and the care to pinch myself to make sure that I'm fully aware of the enormous privilege that I sometimes have to be somewhere with something or with someone. Because I mentioned, one of the greatest joys of my job is being able to learn on that job. And very often in TV, we are thrust before a scientist who is disposed to tell us everything they know about something that I'm intrinsically fascinated by. So sometimes everyone thinks, it must be great, you get up close to these animals. And yes, of course, it is great sometimes to be able to do that. But, the reason I'm there is because I want to understand them as well as just appreciate them. So if there's someone there who knows a lot more about them than I do, and they're telling me everything they know, what a combo. You've got the creature, and you've got, that source of not only learning, but also inspiration. I find it very inspirational to be, amongst academics who are able to creatively and imaginatively unravel how life works. And that's a great and very stimulating environment to be in.
So is there an animal that you haven't been able to study yet that you want to?
Well, there's a few things I haven't seen, but they're mostly sort of, quite self-indulgent, birds that I'd quite like to see. But, it doesn't have to be big and glamorous. Sometimes it's the story that counts, and there can be tiny creatures that you've overlooked in your own backyard. And then someone says, do you know about the such and such hyperparasite? And you say, no. And then they tell you, and it's in a woods around the corner. And its life history and its life cycle can be absolutely astonishing. And that's as uplifting to learn about as it is to travel to some far-flung environment which may have the allure of novelty and the exotic, but may not manifest quite the same excitement on account of the animal might be a bit dull compared to that fly that copulates through the female's head, which is something that I learned about last week,
I was going to ask you about that, actually, because reading your books, it's about storytelling as a way of bringing people into nature. Are you consciously thinking about that? Because it really comes across, and it's a lovely introduction, I think, to the natural world.
The first thing is that very often my challenge is to take something which is intrinsically complex and make it in far shorter form, unfortunately, comprehensible to an audience. Now, that is not dumbing down, and I will never dumb down. And sometimes I am asked by the people that I work with not to use a certain word, at which point I might petulantly say, well, there are dictionaries, But then what I will do, actually, once I've got over the minor irritation of that request, is that I will use the word, but I'll explain what it means. I will never dumb down. And I learned that a long time ago when I first started making television as a presenter. It was a children's programme called The Really Wild Show way back in the 1980s. And as I was on the train travelling there to start the first one, I'd had, plenty of time playing around with animals. I'd kept animals. I'd spent time with animals that were kept in captivity, zoos and safari parks, etc. But I'd spent no time with children. I had a younger sister by 4 years, but not as an adult spending any time with children between about the ages of 8 and 12. And I was thinking, how am I going to communicate with these people? And I sort of thought back to when I was 8 and 12, and, I begged the adult library tickets off of my dad so that I could get the biology books, essentially, out of the adult part of the library. I recognised and remembered that I knew the names, which were scientific names, of all of the dinosaurs of note at that time by the time I was 5 years old. There was no need to oversimplify things for children. And when I hear people saying mini beasts, I cringe, because we don't have to make beasts mini for children. Children are capable of understanding what an invertebrate is if you explain it to them. So by the time I got off the train in Bristol, I'd reconciled that I was going to make little or no effort to change my language. I would change the way I used the language to communicate to younger people, but I was going to speak to them intrinsically as if they were adults. And I think that that's implicitly important. And I think that in order to communicate effectively, you have to engender trust. You have to make sure that people believe what you're saying. I think that you have to draw them in and make them part of a conversation. I think that if you're lecturing to people, then they may turn off. And then I think the key thing is to ask a question which you think they might want to know the answer to. And generally that's predictable because they've turned on and they're watching that program. And then what you do is you uncover all of the information they require to answer that question. And you feed it to them in a way which is logical, and they can pick it up and they can put it together in whatever jigsaw it is. And the most important characteristic is that you let them answer that question for themselves before you tell them. Because if you tell them first, you're just a smart ass. And that's not the objective. You're trying to make them smart. You're trying to tell them a story so that they learn and are enthused by their capacity to learn and learn by the story. And then when you actually tell them the answer to the question, it's a reassuring thing for them. They've been involved in the narrative. They figured it out for themselves. They're empowered by the fact that they are clearly as smart as you are. So there is an art to that sort of storytelling. And I think it comes down to the art of being generous. You've got to give something of yourself away, your passion and your enthusiasm and your commitment to that. And then you have to develop the skill to make sure that whatever you're saying is comprehensible, even if it's quite complex. But ultimately, it's not about you, it's about them. It's not the big I am. It's not the know-it-all, as I say. It's about giving people something that they can make something of themselves. And I like that. You know, we all like that when we watch movies. We're being given something. We're being given a story by actors who are giving their skills, and the directors and screenwriters have all given their skills. They're giving something quite precious to us. And through that generosity, we're able to be excited or rewarded or surprised. And I try to bring that to my sort of broadcasting, basically.
It's lovely because you're giving them a path and tools for discovery themselves.
Yes, and that's a bigger thing than the tools. Allowing people to sort of exercise their minds so they can uncover solutions is more important than the fabric of those solutions in that moment. And there may be other things coming in the future. But yes, that's exactly it. And I think that if you can, expand that empowerment, so it's not just about that story, it's about changing the way people think about something and how they approach, that subject, then that's good. I mean, and ultimately, I have a very strong vocational interest in making natural science programs because I want people to love life. I want them to have the same affinity for it that I have because it's in trouble. And off screen, I'm going to be effectively and metaphorically banging on their door and asking them for their help to look after it. Well, they're not going to be motivated unless they love it. And so, sowing the seeds of romance for the natural world is probably my principal job.
And you've been doing this for decades. Has it changed over time? Do you think people are becoming more interested? Are they starting to understand kind of the urgency, do you think?
I think people have a broader understanding of the environment. That form of education has been refined and has been in the public domain longer. Education in schools has got better in some ways in terms of the content, maybe not the delivery and the regularity of good delivery, but nevertheless, teachers are working really hard to make sure that young people are equipped with the knowledge they need to address these sorts of issues. Hats off to them on that account. And therefore, young people have a far broader understanding. But there are some things where we've failed. And I would argue that from my perspective, it's ecology, it's the joined-uppedness of things. So we can quite easily put a species on a pedestal and we can explain something brilliant about it and it will sparkle, it will shine and people will go, wow. But that's not the greatest beauty because on a pedestal, that organism's in isolation. The greatest beauty is when it's in that complex of life, which is dynamic, but resilient and harmonious. That's the greater beauty. And where I think I and we have failed is getting people to understand that, because if they did, they would understand the fragility of those environments more than they do. And simple things about the fact that sometimes we have to manage wildlife populations because there's an absence of predators or there's the risk of disease. I mean, it could be all sorts of things. And in many ways, I think what might have happened in the past is that we've over-sanctified life. If you cut a tree down, it's invariably seen as more than likely a bad thing. But it could be the wrong tree in the wrong place, and cutting it down could actually be doing nature a favour. You know, I arrived at a house that I bought a few years ago, and the entire garden was overgrown with rhododendron. And my mother used to love rhododendrons, luxurious she would call them, but I always thought they were a little bit over the top. The blooms and the waxy leaves, the simplicity of those very bright colours against that monotonous waxy background was not something that appealed to me. Of course, they were non-native species and they're not helpful. So I went in and just took the lot out, and I've replanted with native species. My neighbour was absolutely horrified because we hadn't got to that point where he could see that that was a progressive thing to be doing. It was a positive thing to be actually cutting something down, but obviously replacing it with something more appropriate. And there, I don't think we've achieved that yet. That's something we've got to work harder on.
I think you're right, because I think people do kind of concentrate on sort of single species, not necessarily realizing the interconnectedness of everything. I mean, you're obviously working on getting that message across, but it's how we get that message across, where we're not just concentrating on single individual species that are often cute, which we have to be a bit careful about, but just that actually there is a huge network, a web of life that's happening here.
Yeah, I think survival of the cutest was very definitely an inhibitor going back to the sort of late 60s and the early 70s. And single species conservation was the thing then. You know, we took a flagship species and we, through effort to understand it and then effort to conserve it, we still use flagship species as a means of generating interest. But I think we have to hope that behind the scenes we're not just focusing on those, we're focusing on looking after their entire ecosystem rather than just that one animal. I mean, I love life. I love absolutely everything. And, you know, if a horsefly bites me, I gently peel it off and tell it to go and bite someone else. If a mosquito comes near me, I, sort of brush it off gently. I don't kill those sorts of things. I never see any life as a nuisance, other than the fact that I just like life, and I can just about imagine being a mosquito and wanting to be alive, and just needing some blood to produce my eggs. It's just what I need, a little bit of blood, But the key thing is that nothing is a nuisance. Everything's got a job to do. And if it's there, it's because that job needs doing. We can't pick and choose the things that we like and dislike. We have to, move on from that. And that's why I rail against the sort of stereotyping of, I don't use the P word, and the P word is the one with the EST after the P, because that's entirely a human construct. What we're looking at invariably when we talk about those Ps is animals which are successful at our expense, and it's almost like we're resentful of it, And of course, some of those Ps need managing. I'm not arguing that, but I would always argue that with the first line of management should be passive. If you've got rats in your kitchen, that's clearly not a good idea. Right? So you could say, right, I've got to trap and kill all of these rats. Or you could say, how can I stop these rats from coming into my kitchen? Shall we just block it up so they can't get in? Okay, we've got rats in the garden. Do they represent a health hazard in that context? If they do, how do we discourage them from coming to the garden? Let's face it, the rats are only there because there's something there for them. What is it? Is it food? Is it shelter? Is it protection from predators? Is it access to mates? There's going to be a reason they're there. And if we can't outthink a rat, and they're pretty smart animals actually, but if we can't outthink a rat without killing it, then frankly, we've got some more evolution to be doing.
We've just been talking about hero species. Is there a particular animal or organism that you feel is really misunderstood by the public?
It's us. It's humanity. I think if there's one thing that we really do need to get a better understanding of, it's ourselves. I don't think we're managing ourselves properly at this point in time. And we're allowing ourselves in some context to be mismanaged. And as a consequence of that, that's the most frightening thing of all, And I think that's one of my real weaknesses, and I've always known that, but now I'm really focusing on trying to address it more than ever. So, for instance, I've never been able to understand why anyone would kill another animal for pleasure. I'm not saying kill another animal. I've killed other animals. I would seek not to do so unless I really have to. But whatever. Doing it for pleasure is different. I think one of the things that's handicapped me when I've tried to push back against the unnecessary killing for pleasure is that I don't understand why people do it. Because I can't get my mind in that space. I can't get my mind in a space where I want to, if we're using a gun, want to pull a trigger to shoot an elephant. I'm never going to be able to understand that. And that has to be a handicap. So it's not that I'm focusing an enormous amount of effort trying to get into the mind of elephant hunters at this point in time, but I am spending a lot more time thinking about how we perceive other species of animal and how that basically defines the way we treat them. And one of the things that strikes me, and it's so fundamental, and it certainly goes back to my youth, and it needs addressing for contemporary youth, is that when we're kids, we're given, I think, 3 sorts of books about animals. We're given a book and it's about pets, companion animals. So it's dogs and cats and rabbits. And we love those ones. We bring them into our lives and we form relationships with them and we feed them and we nurture them and we care for them. And those relationships are enormously rewarding, hopefully for both species, but certainly from a human point of view. That's our pets, our companion animals. Then we're given another book and it's about zoo animals. And this is exotic animals. And these are animals which we don't live with. They come from other parts of the world. We perceive them as being bigger, celebrities, more exciting. And we either keep them in captivity or we do everything we can to conserve them, or a bit of both. And then lastly, we're given a book and it's about farm animals. And farm animals are just there to be farmed so that we can eat them. And that's such a fundamentally flawed construct. And it starts at the child's book stage. Because frankly, pigs are smarter than most dogs. But because they're presented to us as farm animals, we can't therefore in later life ever get over that. It abhors us if we see people eating dogs. But we don't seem to care when people are eating pigs. And it's completely bonkers.
It doesn't make sense, really.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So how would you solve that? What would you do?
Well, I think that we do start at the education stage. I think we do go back and make sure that there's just one book of animals, if you like, and we have far greater equality and understanding of the value of their lives and the way that we should interact with those animals to the benefit of both them and us. But of course, we're dealing with a crisis at the moment, and we know that, for instance, if we just focus on the farm animal aspect of that, we need to eat less meat. So we need to communicate to people that essentially, pigs have rights too, and they certainly, have a right not to live indoors all of their lives in overcrowded and appallingly inhumane conditions, simply to be, inhumanely slaughtered and turned into, food which isn't good for us on supermarket shelves. So we have to work at that. And I think that people do have an intrinsic affinity for and empathy for animals in the main. I think a lot of people wouldn't take that meat off the supermarket shelves if they knew the conditions those animals have been kept in. So awareness, I think, is really important. People say, I can't bear to look. Well, you didn't ought to not bear to look if you're going to eat it, And I think that disconnect for us between ourselves and nature is no greater than when it comes to our food, because that's the one thing that does connect us to nature every single day. If we're fortunate to be able to eat every day, and we're fortunate to be able to choose what we eat every day, then that's what connects us to nature. And it's not just the pig, it's the impact that the pig's had on the environment. All of the, food that it's eaten that's been grown in what was rainforest and shipped all over the world. And the fact that the pig's been medicated and the food's been sprayed by insecticides. And it all adds up to a terrible, environmental cost. I think if people were more aware of that, they'd be moving more rapidly to a plant-based diet. I'm not saying that's the one step to ethical eating. You can eat plant-based and still be consuming lots of processed food, lots of heavily packaged food, lots of food full of palm oil, which, is very damaging to the environment. But I think it's part of a journey we all need to start moving on, because we've got to look for opportunities to be better, not be scared of problems that are making things bad.
So what's bringing you hope these days?
But the fact that we understand all of these things, and the fact that every day people get up and try and understand in more detail, with more clarity, these things. It's not that we don't have a toolkit at our disposal to implement all of the things that we need to do to get started when it comes to addressing these problems. We have a voluminous toolkit. We've got, lots of understanding, lots of technology which we can roll out, and we could be making a difference. But unfortunately, we're not doing that broadly enough and rapidly enough, and we haven't been doing it in that way for so long now that we've reached a crisis. It's not that we didn't know this. Obviously we knew about climate breakdown in the sort of 60s at least, if not before, and certainly when it comes to fossil fuels. When it comes to over-harvesting the seas, I remember travelling to fishing ports with my father in the 70s. Then it was a topic of conversation, but we've not dealt with it. And now we've reached the crisis point, so it's deal with it or bust. And as a consequence of that, unfortunately, we've made it difficult for ourselves, which is a sad indictment, because when you think of humanity, we are the most adaptable, resourceful, imaginative, creative, inventive species. We can fix things. Why is it we always have to break them first? That's the annoying thing.
So it feels like we're slowly moving in the right direction. It's not fast enough.
It's not fast enough, and I fear what will happen, in the interim, before we wake up and really get moving. Because typically we're triggered by something, aren't we? We're triggered by something which puts our species under stress. And, my partner always says, she doesn't like sci-fi films. She absolutely loathes them, actually. But I think I forced her to sit through Independence Day once. And if you're not familiar with it, basically a massive spaceship arrives from somewhere and it hovers over the planet and threatens all of humanity with extermination. And within the space of a few days, the Americans are talking to the Chinese, who are talking to the Russians, and we all come together, and guess what? We beat the aliens, Well, that's happening. It's not a massive spaceship that's come from some other part of the galaxy. It's climate breakdown. That's what's hovering over our planet. And at this point, we're not talking to the Chinese and we're not working with the Russians. We are still fighting one another, which is insane when we're at war with our own world, basically, through our processes. And so, when you think about it, it takes the spaceship to arrive. And the spaceship has arrived a few times recently. It arrived in, 2019, 2020 with COVID. And we saw a global response to something that threatened our species. And we didn't know how bad it was going to be. But within a space of a few months, we'd come up with a vaccine that saved millions of lives. Tragically, millions of lives were lost because we didn't heed the warnings to prepare in the first place. And then going back into the last century, another period when our species was under significant stress would have been the Second World War. It was a global war, and we have hideous wars taking place at the moment, but not on the scale of that horrid conflict. But that put our species globally under an enormous amount of stress. And when you think about, the things that we achieved, even scientific advancements that we made in that period, in a rapid period of 5 or 6 years, it was astonishing. So we can do it. It's a shame that we have to come to a global conflict or a pandemic to kick us up the backside to do it. I'd much be rather, more prudent and using the precautionary principle and implementing those measures now. Why trip over and feel pain? Why not just fix the paving stone?
So what would you say to somebody who feels like they are insignificant, they're just one person and they can't make a difference?
I think when we have these sorts of conversations, people can easily feel overwhelmed that the problems are beyond their personal scope in terms of having any form of impact or positive outcome. And I think we've got to overcome that. The first things that we need to do to get on the road to recovery is to realise that we are important. It's easy to think, we're just a drop in an ocean. But what is an ocean but a multitude of drops is what I always say. So if we do something, we can make a difference. And that sort of self-empowerment, that's the first step to a broader empowerment. And that's something that we need to realise. We live in the semblance of democracy here. We should be able to charge those that we've elected to represent us to do the right thing on our behalf. And it's up to us to make sure that they do that. But to summon the bravery to stand up and ask our politicians to do the right thing, you've got to start doing things for yourself. So what can you do? What are the meaningful things that you can do? Well, people always think that it's like, well, I'm recycling and I car share and I travel by bike. But to some extent, you've been duped because we're only recycling because they are producing an enormous amount of stuff which we have to recycle. The responsibility has been foisted onto our shoulders to do that. If we didn't produce that stuff in the first place, then the responsibility wouldn't be ours. So I think we've got to recognise that we've got to go back to them, whoever they are, and say, listen, you're the ones that are doing the wrong here. You're the ones that are still drilling and exploring for fossil fuels. You're the ones that are therefore telling us that we've got to cut down our journeys and car share and all that sort of stuff. If you weren't drilling this stuff and we were driving through a more rapid transition to renewable energies, we wouldn't have to do that. We're being conned. So let's push back. And there are two things that we can do very easily, and they're very powerful things that make an enormous difference. The one that we've already touched upon is to think about what you eat. We all, as I say, very fortunate maybe in this country to eat every day, and many of us are able to choose what we eat. Choose more wisely. Do cut down on the amount of meat that you eat. That will have enormous ramifications if you cut back on your meat and dairy, on animal welfare and environment, not just at a local level, but on a global scale. And then the second thing, and this is where you can really make a difference very easily, is choose where you keep your money more carefully. Now, you might think, I haven't got a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, it's a tiny amount. But if we all change where we keep our money, how many of us would have to get together, until we were talking billions? When you think of the size of some of our cities, that's making a difference. So if you bank ethically and you insure yourself ethically, and if you have pensions that you choose those ethically with companies that are not investing in fossil fuels or weapons or biodiversity loss, then they will get the message. And they have got that message because some of these very large institutions are already moving in that direction. They're already divesting because they know that those are sunset industries and they know that they will have to change. These are smart people. They're making a lot of money out of our money. Well, let's make our money work for us and secure us a better future. So, in the space of just a few minutes, you can download an app and you can change your bank on your phone. It's not a terrifying prospect. Everything gets switched over instantaneously. When it comes to insurance, look at who you're insuring with. Look at who they're investing in. Now, all of that information is available. There's a great website called Mother Tree that you can look at when it comes to making these sorts of ethical investments. And that's the way that you can personally most radically impact your environmental footprint, is where you keep your money. It doesn't matter whether it's 50 quid, £500, £50,000 or 5 million. Stick it in the right place. Send those people a message that we've got to change.
Chris, thank you so much for talking with me. This was a podcast by the Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath. I'm Turi King, and thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts or comments on this or any other episodes, please contact us through social media. For more information about the Milner Centre for Evolution, you can visit our website.